Good evening. Welcome to the February 11th edition of the Free Thought Forum, presented by the Pennsylvania Nonbelievers. I have a lot to talk about tonight, so I'd like to get right into the subjects. For those of you who are, some of you are aware, this is a live call-in show, and the number will be on your screen if you want to talk to me about anything of subject tonight, or even just things off topic. First order, a couple of things of business. As I mentioned, the organization has several meetings coming up over the next couple of weeks. Actually, we have 5 meetings in the next 3 weeks. The first of which being on Lebanon tomorrow, as well as Harrisburg on the 13th, Chambersburg on the 18th, Lancaster the 26th, and our more important meeting is our annual meeting and elections in York on March the 1st. We will be having a special guest in Harrisburg on the 13th. However, we may be running into inclement weather, so keep up to date. Keep looking for updates on that. For all information, check our website at panonbelievers.org. And speaking of tomorrow, tomorrow is often noted as Darwin Day, which is the celebration of the birthday of Charles Darwin. And it brings up an interesting idea. There's a kind of a bill floating around trying to get a National Science Appreciation Day. Not just for Darwin. I mean, there's tons and tons of other great scientists throughout history, such as Sir Isaac Newton, probably one of the greatest scientists ever. Also, people like Johannes Kepler. I like how Lawrence Krauss talks about Edwin Hubble. He gives us hope for the human race. He started out a lawyer and ended up one of the greatest astronomers in history. But it would be really nice to have a day dedicated to science, because it seems like there are several scientific holidays now, but they're all kind of informal and almost a pun. For example, Pi Day, celebrating the constant pi, which is celebrated on March 14th, 314, or Mole Day on October 23rd. But it would be a great day to celebrate science and celebrate all it's given us. And on the subject of science, and especially Darwin Day, probably the most important event, the most important event of the last week, and possibly for a very long time, was the debate between Bill Nye and Ken Ham. Much talked about, a lot of controversy surrounding it. Bill Nye actually took quite a bit of criticism for even accepting this debate, and I think he got even more criticism, probably rightfully so, for the choice of venue, agreeing to have it at the Creationist Museum. But overall, I got to say he handled himself pretty well, and I thought his strategy was really very good for what he was trying to accomplish. A lot of people, I've heard a lot of criticism against him for not being harsh enough or not going a lot after enough of the arguments. But I think one thing they don't understand, some of these are coming from an atheist perspective, but I think one thing that Bill Nye was really trying to do is not alienate religion in general. Because the creationists try to set up this dichotomy that it's you're either a Christian creationist or an atheist evolutionist, which there's a lot of in-betweens and others. Like, there are a lot of religious that do accept evolution, and actually more Christians accept evolution than not. So, I mean, that's why I think he passed over a lot of the different arguments. He also did a good job, I think, of attacking the claims made about Noah's Ark, which is probably one of the cornerstones of creationist arguments. And really, it was a good point of attack, because it's the most positive claims made and the most falsifiable claims. And he went over showing bit by bit how, if you assume, only a couple, 1,000 kinds of animals on the Ark, we'd actually end up with getting 13 new species a day. And, he just made made lots of other arguments, just showing time and time again how the arguments just aren't plausible for this. And he made a lot of he just made a lot of good appeals to evidence. He never really appealed to any emotions. I thought he gave very sound arguments. Maybe he was a little too polite at times, I will say, and I think that might be a legitimate argument. But I don't think he was really there to trade blows or anything. But I've got to say, and I think it's telling that probably after the debate they ran polls, who do you think won? And 92% voted for Bill Nye. And that was coming from a poll on Christianity Today. So we're talking about a Christian website is definitely not endorsing what Ken Ham did. And I thought the best analysis of what I saw was it wasn't so much that Bill Nye won that debate, but more or less Ken Ham had nothing to present except for a lot of assertions and strawmans. Probably his worst strawman of the night by far was, this is Ken Ham I'm talking about. He said he tried to address the claim that creationists can't do science, and then started to cite creationists who were scientists. His main person of interest was the inventor of the MRI, was a creationist. But that's not very relevant to evolution. It's the claim wasn't that if you're a scientist you can't believe in creation, because there's a lot of branches of science that have nothing to do with evolution or creationism. So it's the idea of being a scientist and holding a creationist perspective is actually not in conflict. Now, if they were a biologist who were also a creationist, then you might have a point. But he was citing people that had nothing to do with it, and really, it really didn't matter, if an oceanographer believed in creationism. It really didn't mean anything. And he also made a lot of appeals to emotion, like moral arguments. He tried to make the debate about morality, which is, I'm glad that Bill Nye stayed away from that, because again, Bill Nye did his best not to attack religion. And if you're going to talk about morality, you're going to talk about this. Bill Nye admitted several times he's not a theologian, and he's not really there to be exercise counter-apologetics. He was there to prevent evidence. And probably among the most disgusting things that Ken Ham said that night was that if evolution is true, what's the point of taking care of old people? They just cost us money. I'm not exaggerating. He actually said that. And Ken Ham also repeatedly tried to redefine science, trying to say that naturalism was somehow arbitrary, an arbitrary definition, which naturalism is science. The scientific method is methodological naturalism. And there was a time, that supernaturalism was sort of a part of science. For example, alchemy used to be be intertwined with chemistry. It's whenever they pulled it out of the supernatural realm, they were able to pull chemistry out of alchemy, and it's actually when we started to make discoveries. And he also tried to do one of the main arguments I've seen Ken Ham. Now, personally, for those of you who don't know me, I was actually homeschooled from the 3rd grade on, and I was given a lot of creationist material growing up. And one of Ken Ham's newer arguments that I've never seen before, I've only seen him start to really use in recent years, is try to segregate observational science from historical science. Now, the traditional argument he always gave is, nobody was there, you can't know what the past was. Now, this is actually a legitimate philosophical problem. Because when we're talking about events in the past, it's always less certain than what we can have witnessed right now. I mean, this is the entire field that historians have is combating this problem, where despite all the evidence, there's always going to be room for doubt. You know, there's always going to be a hint of uncertainty, but to say that because it is in the past we can't know it is lazy, it's dishonest. Because we can tell what's in the past, or at least have a pretty good idea of what happened. I mean, this is why forensics exists, you know, forensic crime scene investigations exist, is because, you know, they can piece together, okay, you know, this is the most likely scenario, or at least be able to rule out other scenarios. And the same is true with looking at the past of evolution. You know, yeah, we can't say for certain. You know, in fact, we've had to go back and correct the tree of life several times. But it's a refinement. It's getting closer and closer to the truth as we get more and more evidence. But to just flatly say, well, you're uncertain, you know, you're uncertain about your position, but I'm certain about my biblical view, therefore I win, is just an intellectually dishonest position. And there was also this rather amusing point where Ken Ham actually tried to say, you know, creationism is the only viable model for origins, and then he turned around and admitted it took faith, and then tried to commit an equivocation fallacy to say, you know, we all take it on faith. Since we don't know for sure, it's faith, which is just nonsense. It's because, you know, there's always a degree of uncertainty to whatever we do, and actually, in a sense, observational science does have its own uncertainty as well. We don't know if the instruments are properly tuned. There's always room for experimental error. You know, we may not understand the theory correctly. And actually, in the case of when we're dealing with atomic theory, sometimes we can't observe it directly. We have to make a prediction and then say, well, what if that happened, you know, what would we expect? And actually, that's how they discovered the Higgs field, is make a prediction to say if we smack two particles together, you know, this is what we should expect coming out of it. And that's what they discovered. Even though there's actually still a very, very, very microscopic uncertainty that it is the Higgs field, but it's good enough for science. You know, absolute certainty doesn't exist, in my opinion. The problem is whenever they flatly state that the Bible is true and that because they can be certain of that, it must be true, which is complete nonsense. And actually, one point I kind of skipped over here was Bill Nye made a good point saying that evolution predicts things. You know, we can say, okay, we have this gap in the fossil, we think it should be here, have this sort of properties. We can predict very specific things with evolution. There's nothing you can predict with the creationism model. They say, well, probably one thing that Ken Ham did say was, well, it predicted kinds of animals, but kinds is like one of the most nebulous words in the English language. By kinds, it's a very loose term. It can mean whatever you want it to. And I think really the main part is that creationists try to do is we have this big tree of life, and they want to cut it off here and say that the trunk doesn't exist. When really, if you start to go back down the tree of life, you see certain, you know, if you go back down, you know, back a ways in the canine family, you can start to see how they look more and more like bears. Or even just, you know, other things their basal forms to, or even, you know, you take a basal primate, it looks like, kind of like a basal form of a bat, you know, where bats and primates are very closely related. So, you know, they don't keep going back down the tree of life. They just want to cut it off here and say that essentially the lower parts of the tree don't exist. Now, there were a couple of very, very telling exchanges during the night. And I think one of the most popular one is, it was a question, during the question and answer session, there was a question posed, what, if anything, would change your mind? And Bill Nye gave a very great answer. He said, you know, here's what we would expect if the flood account was true. You know, we'd expect fossils there'd be a big clump of fossils somewhere in one layer somewhere in the strata. You'd expect to see, you know, animals trying to swim out of it. You know, there's a lot of different things you'd expect to see, or maybe, you know, convince me that the universe isn't expanding, or somehow molecular clocks can reset, referring to radiometric dating. You know, he makes a lot of appeals like, show me any of these pieces of evidence. And actually went on to say, you know, science loves people that prove them wrong. You know, actually, I've even heard Lawrence Krauss say this several times, is, as a scientist, you go to work every day knowing that you could become famous by proving everybody else wrong. So, you know, Bill Nye's answer was, you know, evidence, you know, show me good evidence, and, you know, any one of these pieces of evidence, and I could change my mind. When it was Ken Ham's turn to answer that question, the first words out of his mouth was, well, I'm a Christian. And like the Bible says, those who come believing in Jesus, you know, Jesus will reveal himself to you. So, a way to paraphrase that is, nothing will change my mind. And actually, everyone's known that for a long time, that nothing will change his mind. Because even in the Answers in Genesis website, they have what's called a statement of faith. And in that statement of faith, the last paragraph says, by definition, no perceived or apparent contradiction to the Bible can be valid. So it's really an intellectually dishonest position. And I think what Bill Nye says represents what a lot of us think, is evidence can change our mind if it's compelling enough. But another really great exchange was, the question was posed to Bill Nye, what came before the Big Bang? This is one of the greatest mysteries in science right now. And there was another great answer by Bill Nye where he went on to say, well, you know, we know the universe is mathematically flat, you know, goes through all the expansion, how we know the expansion is happening and accelerating, you know, all the different ways we know this. And when it got down to, what happened before the Big Bang, we don't know. And he came out and said, we don't know, you know. And his message was to inspire the next generations of science, as, you know, maybe you can be the one to find that out. Maybe you can find out, you know, what happened there, you know, or at least have, you know, maybe get a little closer to finding out. And that's really what science is all about, you know. Some people think that scientists have already discovered everything. That's far from the truth. And really, it's when we put aside supernatural explanations to explore you know, what is the truth? You know, is there a natural explanation to this? We've usually found it. You know, a long time ago. Well, before I get on that, Ken Ham's answer was, well, there's a book that tells us how the universe was created. And Bill Nye looked over at Ken Ham, and if looks could kill, you know, Bill Nye just had this look of distaste in his face that I've never seen out of him. Because that kills curiosity. That just says, you know, God did it. We'll never discover the answer to it. Even if it is God, we can't prove it. And that's terrible. It's terrible to tell kids that you know, this answer is not going to be solved. You know, as Charles Darwin once said, ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. It's as those who know too little, not too much, who say this or that will never be solved by science. And that's the thing. It's like, if you want to inspire kids, you have to tell them that we don't know. We're still looking, but we're still looking for that answer. And just to say, God did it, let's give up, I think is tragic. You know, and that's, you know, we need, it really kills inspiration. And I think one thing I want to kind of come back to is I talked recently about radiometric dating. And, you know, of course, you know, that's one of the big arguments against radiometric dating is there's some uncertainty to it. There's a couple of assumptions involved, but they're really just, you know, they're just seemingly reasonable assumptions that the laws of nature don't change themselves overnight. But, or that dating with different methods, you know, dating with different methods will get you different results. But I thought Bill Nye came up with a really good analogy, which was, imagine you go into a building with a bunch of clocks. No two clock is going to say the same thing, just because of mechanical error. Just like when we use dating systems, you know, the precision of our instruments measuring the isotopes isn't precise enough to give us the same answer every single time. But we can establish, you know, a range. You know, it's not going to be older than this. It's not going to be younger than this. But what creationists want to say is, well, if you don't know where it is between here and here, it could be anywhere, which is, again, dishonest. You know, there are times when we can only settle for a range of data and hope maybe in the future our methods will get better. So I think there is, you know, there's admitted uncertainty to science. You know, even the things we can observe, there's an uncertainty. And when we're talking about maybe things that happened in the past, yeah, there's uncertainty. That doesn't mean that, you know, it's the same level of uncertainty. Like, we can be a little bit more certain, a lot more uncertain about what we see in the present. But, you know, there's still a minimum standard of certainty we want to get to. You know, that's why our courts of law say beyond a reasonable doubt. Not beyond any doubt, but just a reasonable doubt. Because beyond any doubt is virtually impossible in the context of humanity. And I thought, you know, and lastly, I thought one of the weirdest things that I saw Ken Ham say was that, let's see if I can find it here, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, that's what it was. He asserted that logic, the rules of logic can only come from God, therefore to use logic to apply for naturalism is to hijack the Christian, how do you put that, is to hijack the Christian worldview or the Christian philosophy and to ultimately hijack science. It was just the most absurd argument I've ever heard. Well, first he starts with a premise that only logic can come from God, which is something I don't think he can even begin to prove. Or, you know, especially when he tries to say logic comes from his God. And that's one thing that Bill Nye tried to make apparent, is there's many different religions that have either their own creationist story or do accept evolution. But I think that's about all I have to say on that subject. I mean, there's a lot of it on the internet, and definitely a lot to talk about. But as I said before, a lot of people even Christians were heavily unimpressed by Ken Ham's performance. You know, you were sitting there going, is that all he has? You know, a were you there argument and trying to poke holes in really irrelevant pieces of science. But I thought, in the aftermath of the debate was actually, I think, was the truly most shocking part of the whole debate, and that was comments made by Pat Robertson. And if you could play the clip of what he said.
There was a bishop in the Middle Ages there, 1800 something, who added up the dates listed in Genesis, and he came up with the world had been around for 6,000 years. There ain't no way that's possible. You know, anybody that's in the oil business knows that he's drilling down. You drill down 2 miles, 3 miles, 4 miles underground. You're coming into all these layers that were laid down by the dinosaurs. And we have skeletons of dinosaurs that go back about 1.65 million years. And to say that it all came about in 6,000 years is just nonsense. And I think the time we come off of that stuff and say this isn't possible.
I was truly shocked when I saw that. And he actually even goes on to say it's just making us look foolish, which is kind of funny coming from Pat Robertson. But it's really weird to hear Pat Robertson say that, because I've seen he's hosted several creationists on his shows, such as Ray Comfort, and just to hear him completely flip around on this issue is really just amazing. I mean, just to hear it come from him. And he's right. I mean, he also goes on to say, I don't know what happened before the Big Bang. Nobody does. I think God did it. And a lot of people can reconcile those beliefs. That it doesn't have to be, the creationists, as I said before, creationists want to depict that in order to accept evolution, you have to reject God, which is utterly false. And, actually, I thought it was funny. Recently, I was reading the book The Devil in Dover by Laurie LeBeau, talking about the 2005 court case, Kitzmiller versus Dover. And I thought it was funny to see that you actually had, when they were trying to, it was a case where they were trying to sneak intelligent design into the school district. When you look at the people involved, almost none of the very, very few of them were actually atheists. You had a Christian plaintiff, a couple of Christian witnesses for evolution. Now, the first person they called was Ken Miller, who is a devout Catholic, and you also had a Christian judge, a very, very conservative Christian judge, who presiding over the case. So there's nothing about this that says it's atheist. Well, it is true that, probably if you're accepting creationists, you're going to be religious, and a lot of people who accept evolution are atheists, but one doesn't imply the other necessarily. So I think it's important that we make that distinction. Now, the last major topic I wanted to talk about tonight, which might actually be multi-part, I hope to talk about maybe a little bit more about this in future episodes, was a blog post by a man named Hemant Mehta. If you don't know who that is, Hemant Mehta is also known as the Friendly Atheist. He has a blog on, I think it's Patheos, which is a pretty common blogging site. And he also has a YouTube channel called The Atheist Voice. And he recently released a video where he was talking about the 9 things atheists should stop saying. And here's an introduction to that video. If you could play the clip.
There are a lot of things that atheists, including myself, say all the time that we really need to stop saying.
And that was the clip. Was, he really wanted to go into, things we could maybe do better at talking about and do a better job of expressing, or maybe things we should just abandon altogether. No, I have a lot of respect for Hemant, because I've seen him also post a video kind of calling out atheists who didn't do their fact-checking, or could have fact-checked better, or maybe paraphrased and depicted it as a quote. So I think it's good to have these internal discussions. And that's actually, on a personal level, that's what I really like about the atheist movement, is these internal discussions are very much allowed. There's, it's how we avoid being dogmatic, really. And even if we disagree with each other, sometimes it's helpful to know, well, why do we disagree with it? So I thought I'd go through a couple of these, and I might get into a little more that he didn't cover, but we'll have to see how much time we have. The first thing he said was, the first thing we should stop saying is, I lost my faith. And his reasoning behind that is because saying you lost your faith makes it sound like it's a bad thing. Like, we lose car keys, we lose things and we regret that. Losing something seems to imply regret. And I actually agree with him on this one. You can either say, I rejected faith. Personally, I was raised in a very religious household, and my personal way of stating it is I let go of my faith. That is to say, like, I really spent a long time trying to cling to it, trying to hold on to it, even though I knew deep down I really didn't believe it. I was really afraid to confront my doubts, and then finally, just one day, I just let go. That was enough. I just couldn't hold on. I just didn't want to hold on anymore. It was too much for me to hold on anymore, and I just let go. That, to me, that's a much better way of putting it, depending on your situation, of course. But, I think Jerry DeWitt once said, I didn't lose my faith, I graduated from it, but I took the course very seriously. And I think that's a good sentiment to have. Now, the second thing he said on his list, which I actually strongly disagree with him saying this, was he thinks we should stop saying extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But his reasoning behind it is pretty bad. He said it sometimes seems to present a unreachable burden of proof, and I can kind of sympathize with that. And then he goes on to say, well, maybe we can say, is there any evidence for this at all? And then maybe we'll talk. But I disagree with that portion of it. I think we do need to do a better job of explaining what we mean by extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and why that's important. I think some of the best examples for that is, say, the 3-hour eclipse of the sun that was 3-hour supernatural darkness that was supposed to come with the crucifixion of Jesus, as depicted in the Gospels. Think about that. That's an extraordinary claim, to say that was a worldwide darkness, supernatural, for 3 hours. What kind of evidence would we expect? Well, contrary to some opinions, there was actually a lot of good scientists back 2,000 years ago. And there were a lot of, very interested in astrological phenomena. There were people in Egypt, Rome, Greece, even over in China, who were good at at observing science and recording it. And they didn't record that at all. We would, if that supernatural darkness really happened, okay, that's extraordinary. But the extraordinary evidence would be people from all over the world reporting it, simultaneously, and not having an explanation for it. That would compel me to believe that there was a supernatural darkness. But the only thing they actually present is some vague reference to an eclipse, which we don't have anywhere near the original manuscript, original documentation of. In fact, all we have is actually double hearsay if you trace the line of documentation back. And that's just not enough to compel belief. So that's what we mean by, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That's, this is if this is an extraordinary claim, this is kind of what we'd expect the fallout to be, and we're not seeing that. Now, why is that important? Well, actually, the reason that's important is if we don't demand that evidence, we can be led to believe anything. For example, the story of the 3-hour darkness is not unique to the story of Jesus. It shows up in the story of Romulus, too, the Roman state god of Romulus, which predated Christianity. So, there I have, a little documentation about a 3-hour darkness. Here I have a little documentation about a 3-hour darkness. Who's right? Well, I don't think either of them are, because none of them really compel that. So maybe we can stop saying it so flatly, like, you know, oh, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and leave it at that. But I don't think it's a burden of proof that we should drop, as he kind of suggests. I think the better way is to actually explain what that means and why it's important. Now, number 3 on his list is everyone is born an atheist, and I agree. This is one of those things, it's technically true, but it doesn't really mean anything. Yeah, you know, you could say that, but it's not an informed decision at all. You know, I would protest to someone calling a child a Christian child, but, you know, to be consistent, I think, you know, we also have to say it would be bad to declare a child an atheist child. It's really kind of an undefined position. You really don't know. They don't have enough information to really make to say for sure one way or the other. So I don't know how many people actually say this, but it's definitely, you know, there's a difference between something that's technically true and something that's usefully true, I guess would be a way to say it. Now, the next one on his list, number 4, is we can be good without God. And this one I'm going to have to develop quite a bit, because it really deals with the moral argument. And Hemant Mehta's rationale behind that is because no one really believes that. And because what he said was something like, you know, everybody, you know, most Christians believe that that morality was written into our hearts by God, and that, you know, everyone thinks that, okay, everyone admits, yeah, I've got an atheist friend who lives a moral life. Now, I think this is an interesting point I'd like to spend some time on, because it's really a distinguishment that needs to be made, is whether or not you know, you can be good without God existing, or good without a belief in God existing, because those are 2 different things. A lot of times when I hear atheists address the moral argument, they address whether or not you can be good without the belief in God, where you actually, where, you know, whether, but the Christians don't really care whether or not you believe. They say, well, God exists, therefore you have morality. But really, I think the better way to, what has to be addressed in this argument is that to say we can be good without God has an implication to it. The implication is that there's this moral standard, and you can either live up to it by believing in God, or saying I can be good without God is saying I can get there without the belief in God. But that's kind of assuming that there's this flat moral standard. I think what we need to show them is how much we feel that Christianity can be immoral at times, and the concept of God can be immoral. Like, you can bring up some of the things that, you know, God commanded his followers do in both the New and Old Testament, and show how morality is more. Matt Delahunty had a great speech once called "The Superiority of Secular Morality," showing that not only can we be moral, you know, we have our own a moral set. It can actually be, by some, be considered better, because we don't want to inhibit the rights of others, or to infringe on anybody's personal beliefs, or freedom to do what they want. And I think that's one point. Yeah, I think with this sort of argument, you have to go on the aggressive about, and show them that there's not this moral standard that one moral standard we're all being judged good or bad by. And I think that's a distinguishment that's not really well made at times. But I think the thing we have to remember is the moral argument is unavoidable. You know, we have to have a good answer for this. I mean, as I talked about before, in a debate that was supposed to be about science, Ken Ham brings up a moral argument. It's just simply unavoidable. It's one of the first things I learned when I was starting to look into counter-apologetics, is no matter what you're talking about, it's always going to come down to morality. Every single debate is about morality. It's what we have to get used to, and we've got to get a better answer about it. And saying we can be good without God is not a good answer. And we have to explain, how morality can develop naturally, and how morality is, different for us than, say, for a Christian, where, and you can even point out in some denominations, they heavily regulate, the skirt length of women. Some say it has to be all the way down to the ankles. Some say it just has to be below the knees. And that's their moral code, and they're all different. And one would say one is good and the other is bad. I think that's one thing. That's one thing that's worth pointing out. And then, of course, you go over to the Muslims, and they wonder why you let them show any skin at all. So that's the idea. You have to understand that. I'm personally one not to. I don't personally believe that objective morality exists. Although, some atheists would debate me on that, and I think there's a debate to be had on that. But I think we have to show that there are different moral standards for each group, and sometimes we find the moral standards of Christianity a bit repulsive, in fact, and that's where a lot of the arguments against Christianity come from, is questioning the morality of Christianity. And that's why I think for moral arguments, you really have to be aggressive. Now, his next comment, I'm not really sure what he really meant by it. It said something to the effect, I trust science and not some 2,000-year-old book. And I think the point he was trying to go for was the Bible isn't this 2,000-year-old book. It was written over the span of many hundred years. The first section we have, I think, dates back. There's a scrap, I think, that dates back to about, I think, around 750 BC, somewhere around there. It's a very small fragment out of the book of Numbers. And, we have fragments dating up. I think the first fragment of the Gospel of John shows up around 125 AD. And then we have different canons and different books of the Bible. I think it's better to distinguish where the Bible comes from in this case, I think, is what the point he was trying to go with. And I think that's a better point to make. I think there's a general point to be made here about just flatly stating stuff like that. Flatly stating, well, it's just a 2,000-year-old book. The age of a book might affect its credibility slightly, but you got to do better than that to discredit it. You have to talk about, well, why isn't it credible? There's a lot more to it than just, well, it's 2,000 years old. And I think, as I said before, we can't even say it's 2,000 years old. It wasn't. There was a lot of books coming in and out of it, and we've discovered, especially in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that they were using things as scripture that didn't make the Bible. And the same can be true for rival sects of Christianity throughout the years. So number 6 on his list was, you can't reason someone out of something you can't reason someone out of something that they weren't reasoned into. And this is sometimes an argument is just to say, well, we're not going to reach these people. Why even bother talking to them? Which is complete nonsense. In any way, shape, or form, anybody you're talking to, it's nonsense. If you look at the most outspoken advocates we have in the atheist movement today, the majority of them are former believers. Many of them former ministers. Look at Dan Barker. He was a missionary when he was a teenager, and was a Pentecostal preacher evangelist for well over 20 years. The same for Jerry DeWitt, and the many others. Or Seth Andrews, host of the Thinking Atheist podcast, probably the most popular podcast for atheists. was a former believer for many years. He worked Christian radio for 10 years. I mean, we've had people who have not only been believers, but really been wrapped up in the movement, who have had their minds changed. You know, for me, you know, there was a point where I was struggling with my own doubts about my belief, and, you know, I stumbled across, you know, a video where somebody was openly challenging that belief. And it got me to say, oh, you know, I'm not the only one with those doubts. I'm not the only one who thinks that. Or just, you know, maybe make them look at things at a way that they haven't looked at before. Which actually reminds me of something. Because, you know, actually a lot of, you know, they found a lot of Christians don't actually read the Bible. You know, they think they know what's in it, but, you know, if you start to point out, you know, hey, this is this and there, and they, you know, get them to go investigate it, you know, they might change their mind. And, you know, I think, you know, and actually an underlying part of it here that was also pointed out is saying that, you know, someone wasn't, you know, assuming that they weren't reasoned into it. Everybody takes the stance they are for a reason. It may not be a good reason, but it's a reason. You know, somebody asked, you know, one of the other most outspoken atheists, I kind of mentioned a couple times before, his name is Matt Delahunty. He also runs a public access TV show called The Atheist Experience. And he was a fundamentalist Christian for 20 years and was actually studying to become a Baptist minister when he ultimately came to reject his faith. And people ask, well, how did you stay a non-believer? How did you stay a believer for so long? And he said flatly, it never occurred to me to question. And that's the case with a lot of people. Is it doesn't occur to them that there's another way to live, that there's another way to think, that other people think that way too. So, yes, you can reason. You know, everyone believes what they are for a reason, so they can be reasoned out of it. His next comment was number 7. I don't believe the things he said. The things he said was, I don't believe in a God. I don't believe in God is what he said. What we should stop saying. And this actually was kind of sort of a ridiculous argument, because it was more of an argument over semantics, where he said, well, I don't believe in God, which might imply it exists anyway, or just because you don't believe in something may mean it exists anyway. I really don't get his point here, what he's trying to get at. To me, it's just an argument over semantics. He tries to say, well, maybe we should say, I don't believe God exists, which actually doesn't solve the problem anyway. And saying, it just seems to be an argument over semantics that I don't really feel worthwhile to say. And it just doesn't seem like doesn't seem like a worthwhile argument. Now, I'd actually like to digress on this point. Something I mentioned earlier was, you know, I think even if, you know, looking over lists like this, you know, I don't have to accept everything he said, but it's still nice to, you know, have an opinion challenge, just so maybe I can better understand why I hold that opinion. Now, number 8 on the list was religion doesn't make sense. And this is sort of along the same lines as you can't reason someone into something they weren't reasoned in to begin with. Just like they had reasons to believe in God, to them religion makes sense. You know, they think, well, I even saw this one book in Barnes & Noble's one day. It was called Why Religion Makes Emotional Sense, which to me was a bit of an oxymoron, but to them, you know, emotional sense, you know, emotionally to them, it satisfies an emotional need, so to them it makes sense just to believe it, or perhaps they get something out of it. It makes sense to them. And I agree with what he goes on to say, which is, better use of words would be things like immoral, or religion is immoral, illogical, irrational, things like that. But to say it doesn't make sense is, sense is another relative term that we have to understand. Is what makes sense to somebody may not make sense to somebody else. And the last thing he's mentioned was you can't pick and choose what you believe. Now, what he meant by this was that what he wasn't talking about is, there's two arguments, two ways of looking at this. One is he was talking about, can we actually choose? Well, he wasn't talking about this, but some people interpret that to mean we can't choose what we believe, which I actually agree with that, if that wasn't the argument he was making, but it could be interpreted as that. But, can we choose what we believe? I actually don't think so. I think what we believe is based on the facts floating around in our head. What he was actually talking about is what's often referred to as a cafeteria Christian, someone who just picks little pieces here and there of the doctrine that they believe in. Like, they might reject the idea of hell, or they might accept homosexuality, even though the Bible is very clear about what it says about that. And he says, we shouldn't criticize people for doing that. And I think this is probably one of the more controversial things he said, was that, should we make people, it's like we say, it's like us asserting that in order to be a Christian you must hold to the literalist view, which I don't personally think is a very good approach, because it really gives them a no way out situation for a conversation. We either say, yes, you either have to accept all the Bible, or your faith has no foundation. Now, personally, that's a crossroad I came to, was, I didn't feel like, picking and choosing had any foundation to it, any logical foundation. But others find a foundation to it. And I think it's an interesting way to get them thinking, but I think it should be worthwhile to mention to them that, hey, you're picking and choosing this. Why do you pick this and not this? Not necessarily in an accusative, argumentative tone of voice, but just, it's a good way to start a conversation, actually. And I like what someone said once, where they said, part of the problem with atheists right now is sometimes we seem more interested in debate than conversation. And I think saying, like, just coming at them with, you can't pick and choose this and this and this, is trying to debate them. But to say, oh, why do you take this and this but not this, is a good way to have a conversation. And I think conversation is important, because there are times that we do have to work. We work together with believers all the time, and it's important to have a conversation, mostly just to have an understanding of each other, so that we can understand each other's belief. We'll understand what our positions are. Now, the atheist movement is full of former believers. We have a very good understanding, but we really only have. Personally, I was raised in a fundamentalist Christian environment, so I only have an understanding of that environment. Somebody from a liberal and more liberal Christian environment might have a different understanding of the situation and might be able to rationalize picking and choosing. So I think it's better to leave that out more in terms of having a conversation. And I think that's really the focus of a lot of these, is just focusing on the conversation rather than just fiercely debating. Now, there is a place for debate. I'm not going to argue with that. But I think when we're just let's not go looking for debates all over the place. Let's be interested in conversations, which actually is a point I want to get across for as we go tabling this year, our first table will be on Mother's Day this year in York. And I'd like to see, sometimes it gets argumentative. It gets very, very argumentative at tables. And maybe if we, have a little bit of a softer touch, we can actually have a decent conversation. Not say, well, we use this argument to just to try to stump them and try to kill the conversation, rather than saying, oh, you believe that? Okay, well, why do you believe that? And how do you deal with this problem? How do you deal with this problem? And going back to kind of the creationist arguments, a lot of their arguments against evolution are kind of that way. It's like, how you can't explain this, ha, I got you. Whereas, I think it's best to lay off those kinds of arguments. At least, even if they don't lay off them themselves, maybe we can, if we treat it with a light touch, it can actually be a much better conversation. In fact, I've gotten into internet debates which are notoriously argumentative, where I got into a conversation with someone and they started out very argumentative with me, and I addressed their points as calmly as I could, just expressing my point of view, and it actually turned into a very good conversation about a particular very controversial topic. And at the end, I actually had to admit he changed my mind about the topic, And I conceded points, and he started conceding points. We had a good conversation, but at the end, he followed my line of reasoning and go, well, maybe right here you have a problem. And he pointed out, and I'm like, yeah, maybe my step from here to here in the logic isn't as good. Now, actually, that list he took was from a much larger list, which you can find on the YouTube channel, on his YouTube channel. Again, it's the Atheist Voice. And maybe I'll pick some up for next time, our next episode. I'm sure I can come up with more arguments that maybe would be better if atheists didn't use. So, and I can definitely think of a couple more right now, but we'll get into that next episode. We're running out of time here for today. So, as a reminder, we have a lot of meetings coming up. If you could check the website, and as it's posting on the screen, our annual meeting is March 1st. This is where we have our annual elections. So you don't want to miss out on that. And that is all I have for this week's episode. Again, the next episode is Tuesday, February 25th. And I hope we can get some more callers next time. Get a conversation going. I'd love to talk to anybody. So again, next meeting's in Lebanon, and I wish you all a happy Darwin Day.